Let me tell you something about the night I found the letter. It was almost midnight. The house was quiet in that particular way that farmhouses get quiet in winter, which is a different kind of silence than anything you have ever heard in a city. It is not peaceful. It is heavy. It presses against your ears like something alive. The wood stove had burned down to embers, and I was cold and I could not sleep, and I did not know why yet, but my body knew. My body had been trying to tell me something for months. I got up to get a glass of water, and I passed the small wooden desk in the hallway where Eli kept his papers. He was meticulous about that desk, everything in its place. I had never once gone through it. 12 years of marriage and I had never felt the need or the desire to look through my husband's papers because I trusted him with everything I had, with my whole life, with my children, with my future. The letter was sitting on top, not hidden, not folded small and tucked away, just sitting there, like it wanted to be found. I almost walked past it. I almost went back to bed. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the handwriting. The handwriting was a woman's, and it was familiar in a way I could not immediately place. It was not threatening looking. It was not written in anger. The letters were careful and rounded, and they looked almost gentle, and that is the thing that made my stomach drop before I had even read a single word. Gentle letters do not come from strangers. I picked it up and I read it, and then I sat down on the cold hallway floor because my legs stopped working. And that is how I learned that the man I had been married to for 12 years, the man I had followed into one of the most closed and demanding communities in America, the man I had given up my entire former life for, was not exactly who I thought he was. But here is the thing about that story. Here is the part that nobody tells you, the part that gets left out of every documentary and every news article and every dramatic retelling of what it means to leave or be left or be lied to inside the Amish world. It was not simple. None of it was simple. And the longer I sat on that cold floor, the more I realized that I was not just dealing with a betrayal. I was dealing with a man who had been shaped by forces so old and so deep that even he did not fully understand them. And I was dealing with myself, a woman who had chosen this life with open eyes, and who was now going to have to figure out what came next in a world that had very few road maps for situations like mine. So let me back up. Let me tell you the whole thing. Because if you think this is just a story about a husband who lied, you are going to miss everything that actually matters. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Middle-class, divorced parents, the kind of childhood that is fine without being remarkable. I was the kid who read too much and talked too much and had opinions about everything, which made me popular with some teachers and exhausting to a lot of the people around me. I went to Ohio State for 2 years before I ran out of money and motivation at almost exactly the same time, and then I spent 3 years doing what people my age did in the mid-90s. I was 24 when I met Eli. I was waitressing at a diner outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I had moved there on a whim after a bad breakup and a worse year. I knew nobody. I had a studio apartment that cost more than it should have, and a bicycle I had bought secondhand, and that was more or less the full inventory of my life at that point. The first time Eli came into the diner, he was with his father and 2 of his brothers. They were dressed plainly. Dark trousers, suspenders, broad-brimmed hats that they took off at the door. I had seen Amish people before. Everyone in that part of Pennsylvania had. But I had never spoken to one, not in any real way. He ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and when he looked up at me to say thank you, his eyes were so direct and so calm that it actually startled me. That sounds like a small thing, but I want you to understand that I had spent most of my adult life around men who could not look at you directly, who were always looking slightly past you or through you or at their phone. And here was this man whose entire attention landed on you like something physical. I thought about him for days afterward. He came back the following week, and the week after that. And one afternoon in October when I brought him his coffee, he said, quietly and without a trace of awkwardness, that he had enjoyed talking with me the last few times, and he wondered if I might like to take a walk sometime. I said yes before I had time to think about what I was saying yes to. What followed was the strangest and most exhilarating courtship of my life. I want to be clear about something before I go further. There is a version of this story that gets told sometimes, usually by people who have never experienced it, that goes something like this. Naive English girl falls for the simple charm of Amish life, gets seduced by the romance of it, does not understand what she is getting into. This version positions me as either foolish or desperate, and I reject it completely. I was neither foolish nor desperate. I was curious. I was someone who had been living a shallow and directionless life and who had suddenly encountered something with depth and rootedness, and a kind of seriousness that I had not known I was starving for. Eli was not a novelty to me. He was not a fantasy. He was a person, an actual complicated and thoughtful person, and I fell in love with who he was before I fell in love with the world he came from. That distinction matters enormously, because it is the key to understanding everything that came later. Our courtship lasted almost 2 years. It was slow by any standard, and almost incomprehensibly slow by mine. We walked together. We sat on the porch of his parents' farmhouse in the evenings, sometimes with family nearby, and sometimes not. We talked about everything that did not violate the unspoken boundaries of what could be discussed between an unmarried man and woman in his community. And within those limits, we talked with a freedom and an honesty that I have rarely found anywhere since. He told me about his faith, not as a performance or a recruitment pitch, but as the actual texture of how he moved through the world. He told me what he believed about simplicity and about community and about the dangers of pride, which he called Hochmut in German, the lifting of the self above others, and he talked about it with a humility that was real and not practiced. I told him about my life, the messy, unsatisfying sprawl of it. He did not judge me. He asked questions, quiet and specific questions that showed he had actually been listening. By the time he asked me to consider baptism and marriage, I understood what I was choosing. I had spent those 2 years reading everything I could find about Old Order Amish life. I had spoken with his mother and his sisters, who were cautious with me but not unkind. I had thought seriously and at length about what I would be giving up, and I had decided, as a grown adult woman with no illusions about the difficulty of what I was doing, that the life being offered to me was worth the cost. So I was baptized into the church. I learned Pennsylvania Dutch. I learned to sew my own dresses and to can vegetables and to bake bread in the kind of quantities that would have seemed absurd to my former self. I learned to get up before dawn because there was always something that needed doing before dawn. I learned to exist without the internet, and without television, and without most of the things that I had assumed were necessary for a functioning life, and I discovered that they were not necessary at all, and that their absence created a kind of spaciousness in daily life that I had not expected to love as much as I did. Eli and I were married in his parents' barn on a November morning when the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. There were 400 people at the wedding. I had invited 3 people from my previous life: my mother, my best friend from high school, and a cousin who I was fond of. My mother cried the entire time and told me afterward that she did not understand, but that she could see I was happy and that she would try to trust that. I was happy. That is the truth. For years I was genuinely, substantively happy. Now let me tell you about the things that were harder. I want to give you an honest account of Amish life, because most accounts are either romanticized or horrified, and neither one of those captures what it is actually like to live it. The community I joined was conservative even by Old Order standards, which means that the role of women was clearly defined and not particularly flexible. This was not a surprise to me. I had known this going in, but knowing something and living it are 2 different experiences, and there were days when the gap between what I had expected and what I was actually feeling was wider than I could have anticipated. I had opinions, strong ones, about how things should be done, about decisions that affected the whole family, about the community itself. And the expectation was not that my opinions did not matter. It was more subtle than that. The expectation was that I would voice them to my husband privately, and that he would make the final decision, and that I would support that decision publicly even if I disagreed with it privately. Eli was good about this, better than many men in the community. He genuinely listened to what I said in private, and he changed his mind more often than I had expected he would. There were times when I felt genuinely heard and times when I felt invisible, and I learned to tell the difference and to manage my expectations accordingly. The loneliness was harder than I expected, not because I was isolated. I was surrounded by people constantly. Amish communities are dense with human contact in ways that most modern lives simply are not. But I was surrounded by people who had known each other since birth, who shared a history and a language and a set of references that I could learn but never fully inhabit. I would always be the English woman who had joined. That was not unkind, it was simply true, and on some days it sat heavier than on others. We had 4 children in 7 years. 3 boys and then a girl who came last and who had Eli's exact eyes. We named her Hannah, which worked in both Pennsylvania Dutch and English, which mattered to me in ways I could not fully articulate. By the time Hannah was 2 years old and I had been in the community for over a decade, I felt like I had made it. Like I had passed through the hardest part of being an outsider and come out on the other side as something closer to a real member of the community. I was trusted with responsibilities I would not have been given earlier. Younger women came to me with questions. I had friends, real ones, not just neighbors, and Eli and I had built something that felt solid and true, or so I believed. Now we are back to the letter on the hallway floor. I need to tell you about who wrote it, because the who matters as much as the what. Her name was Ruth, and she was a widow from a community about 30 miles away. I had met her twice, briefly, at community gatherings. She was quiet and capable, and no one had ever said anything to me that would have made me look at her differently than I looked at anyone else. She and Eli had known each other since childhood. They had been, as the letter carefully and painfully described, very close friends before his Rumspringa, which is the period in late adolescence when Amish young people are given a degree of freedom to experience the outside world before deciding whether to be baptized and commit to the community. During that time, Ruth's family had moved away. They had eventually joined a different district. She had married someone else. Eli had stayed, been baptized, and eventually met me. What the letter described was this. Over the past 2 years, Ruth's husband had died, and Ruth and Eli had been writing to each other. Just letters, she emphasized, just letters. She was not a person who would do anything improper. But she felt she had to be honest with me because she had come to understand from their correspondence that Eli had never fully closed that chapter of his life. And she believed I deserved to know that there was a part of him she felt she knew better than I did. And she was writing to me because she thought the right thing to do, the Christian thing, was to put this in my hands rather than let it continue to grow in the dark. I read the letter 3 times on that cold floor. Then I went and I made coffee, because it was the only thing I could think to do that would take 5 minutes and use my hands. And I waited for my husband to wake up. He came downstairs at 5 in the morning, which was his usual time, and he found me sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in my hands and the coffee already cold. I have thought about his face in that moment many times in the years since. I have tried to read it backward and forward to figure out what I was seeing. There was no defiance in it, no anger at being caught. What I saw was something closer to grief, and not grief for himself. Grief for me, which in some ways was harder to deal with than anger would have been. He sat down across from me and he did not try to explain before I had spoken. That was one of his qualities. He had always known when to wait. I said, I found a letter from Ruth. He said, I know. I said, you left it where I would find it. He looked at the table and then back at me and he said, I did not know how to begin a conversation I should have begun a long time ago. What followed was 4 hours of talking. The longest unbroken conversation we had ever had. The children were still asleep, and the world outside the frosted windows was still dark, and we sat across from each other at that kitchen table, and he told me things that rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past 12 years. He told me that Ruth had been his first love, that they had planned to leave together during Rumspringa, to leave the community entirely and make a life somewhere else, that when her family moved away unexpectedly, he had felt the decision had been made for him. He had stayed. He had been baptized. He had built the life he was supposed to build. He said, "I was not unhappy. I want you to understand that. What we have is real. What I feel for you is real. But there is a part of my life I put away without finishing it properly, and I have carried it every day since." I asked him what the letters had been. He said they were just letters. He said Ruth's letter to me had been accurate. He said nothing improper had happened, but that the letters had been a way of revisiting the version of himself that had almost chosen differently, and that he had known it was wrong to continue them without telling me, and that he had not been able to stop, and that this was the honest truth even though it was not a good enough answer. I asked him, "What did you think you were doing? Did you think I would never know?" He said, "I think I believed that if I kept it contained, if I never let it become anything more than words on paper, that I could have some part of myself that was only mine and that it would not hurt anyone." I said, "It hurt me." He said, "Yes." I want to pause here and tell you something that might be uncomfortable, because I think it is important. When people hear this story, they tend to want me to tell them what to feel about Eli. They want him to be a villain or a saint, and most people lean toward villain because that is the more satisfying narrative. Man deceives devoted wife. Wife finds out. Dramatic confrontation. The end. But I was sitting across from a man I had known for 14 years by that point, including the courtship, and I could see him. I mean, I could actually see him in that kitchen. Not the character in a story, but the actual person. The man who had gotten up every morning before sunrise for 12 years to do the hardest physical labor imaginable to provide for our children. The man who had sat with me through a difficult birth and not left my side for 30 hours. The man who had fought quiet battles inside a community that did not always welcome my presence and had always landed on my side. The man who had tried, genuinely tried, in all the ways that mattered most to be a good husband. And also the man who had been carrying a ghost for 12 years and who had, in the end, been too afraid to bring it into the light until it had been forced there by someone else. Both things were completely true. I was not confused about either of them. What I had to figure out, sitting in that kitchen with the cold coffee and the sleeping children overhead, was what I was going to do with both of those true things.